There's something different about people who'd rather be disliked than fake it. Maybe it's the way they can sit through awkward silences without scrambling to fill them. Maybe it's how they can say no without following it with an apology, explanation, or justification. Or maybe it's that peculiar kind of peace that comes from knowing exactly who they are, even when everyone around them wishes they were someone else. Because these people haven't just opted out of the popularity contest. They've discovered something about social approval that most people spend their entire lives missing. And trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to see why choosing authenticity over likability creates some of the most psychologically liberated people you'll ever meet. Most people are running a constant background program. Am I liked? Do they approve? Should I adjust? It's exhausting, invisible, and never stops. But this group shut that program off entirely. Not because they're antisocial or contrarian, but because they figured out something crucial about the cost of being liked. What you're about to understand isn't about being difficult or provocative for its own sake. It's about a specific psychological architecture that forms when someone discovers that the price of universal approval is too high. And what emerges in its place might be the most authentic version of human confidence we have. Picture this. You're 10 years old, sitting at the lunch table with your friends. Everyone's laughing at something, mocking another kid, agreeing with a mean comment, going along with the group's judgment. And you feel it. That moment where you have to choose between saying what you actually think or staying silent to remain included. It's a Tuesday afternoon in 5th grade. Your friend group is huddled together, and someone makes a cutting remark about the kid who sits alone. Everyone laughs. That particular laugh that signals agreement, belonging, membership in the in-group. They look at you, waiting for your laugh too. It's such a small thing, just a sound you need to make. Just curve your mouth, produce that noise, and you stay inside the circle. But something stops you. Maybe it's that you don't think it's funny. Maybe it's that you know that kid didn't deserve it. Maybe it's just that you're tired of pretending to agree with things you don't actually agree with. So you don't laugh, you shrug, or you say that's kind of mean, or you just stay quiet. And you watch, in real time, as the energy shifts, as they look at you differently. As you become, in that instant, slightly outside the circle you were just inside. You've just made a choice that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You chose being right over being liked. And something crystallized in that moment. What psychologists call authentic self-presentation typically develops gradually through adolescence. But some people experience what researchers at the University of Rochester identified as early authenticity events. Moments where the cost of self-betrayal becomes suddenly, viscerally unbearable. These aren't acts of rebellion. They're moments of psychological clarity. The person discovers that maintaining group approval requires continuous self-editing, and in that discovery, something shifts. What most people experience as fitting in, they begin to experience as performance. And the cognitive dissonance between who they are and who they're pretending to be becomes intolerable. This early choice creates adults who've been practicing authenticity since childhood, while most people are still calculating how their opinion will be received before they share it. This group stopped doing that math decades ago. They're not trying to be difficult. They've just spent years watching people exhaust themselves maintaining an image, and they opted out of that particular form of labor. They don't experience social disapproval as rejection of their worth. They experience it as information. This person wants me to be different than I am. That's just data, not devastation. But that childhood choice was just the beginning. Because once you've made that decision once, you keep making it. And every time you do, you're building something most people never develop: complete immunity to the need for universal approval. Now, let's talk about what that looks like in practice. You're at a work meeting. Someone proposes an idea that everyone's nodding along to. You can see the problems with it, the logic gaps, the unexamined assumptions, the likely failure points. You have two options: stay quiet and be liked, or speak up and be the person who ruins the vibe. Picture yourself in that conference room. The energy is positive. Everyone's excited. Your manager loves the idea. Your colleagues are already building on it, adding their enthusiastic yes and contributions. The momentum is building. This is the moment where most people think, maybe I'm wrong. Everyone else seems on board. Even if I'm right, is it worth it? But you're different. You raise your hand. I see some issues with this approach. You watch the energy deflate like air leaving a balloon. Someone's smile freezes. Your manager's expression shifts from excited to annoyed. You're now that person. The skeptic. The negative one. The person who doesn't get it. You can feel the subtle social temperature drop. After the meeting, people avoid eye contact in the hallway. Nobody asks you to lunch. And here's the thing. You're completely fine. This isn't bravado. You're not pretending it doesn't sting. You're just able to hold a simple thought. I'd rather be useful than liked. Being disliked for being right is infinitely more comfortable than being liked for going along with something you know won't work. This is what researchers call high tolerance for social exclusion. Most humans have a deep evolutionary need for group belonging. Our ancestors survived through tribal cohesion. But some people have what psychologist Roy Baumeister identified as an unusually high rejection threshold. They process social disapproval through a different filter. Where most people experience rejection as threat, they experience it as feedback about compatibility. They're not defective at reading social cues. Brain imaging studies show they process social information normally. They just weight it differently. Accuracy ranks higher than acceptance in their internal value hierarchy. These are the people who can deliver difficult feedback without sugarcoating it. Who will tell you what you need to hear rather than what you want to hear. They're often valued professionals precisely because they're willing to be the bad guy when everyone else is too concerned with being liked. But there's a cost. They're rarely invited to happy hours. They don't get included in the casual social networks that often matter for advancement. They're respected more than they're loved. And they've made peace with that trade-off in ways most people never do. But here's what's remarkable. This wasn't something they woke up one day and decided. It was built into them through early experiences that taught them something crucial about the relationship between authenticity and belonging. You're 7 years old at the dinner table. Your uncle is telling a story everyone's laughing at. But you notice something? The story isn't true. You know it isn't true. And you feel that pressure. Let it go, or correct him and ruin the moment. Picture this family dinner. Your extended family is gathered, and Uncle Mike is holding court. He's telling this elaborate story about something that happened last summer. Everyone's engaged, laughing at all the right moments. But you were there. You know the story is wrong, not just exaggerated for effect, but fundamentally inaccurate. He's misremembering or revising, painting himself as the hero when things didn't actually happen that way. You're 7. You speak up. That's not how it happened. The table goes quiet. Uncle Mike's face changes. Your mom shoots you a look. Someone says, "Mike's telling the story, honey." The message is clear. We protect the mood, not the truth. We preserve comfort, not accuracy. Being liked is more important than being right. But something in you can't accept that trade. Even at 7, even with all the social pressure in the world bearing down on you, that exchange feels wrong. You'd rather be the kid who doesn't understand social niceties than the kid who learns to lie by silence. Family systems theory identifies what researchers call truth tellers in family dynamics, individuals who resist collective fictions. Developmental psychologist Susan Harder found that children who maintain authentic self-expression despite family pressure develop what she termed differentiated self-concept, a stable sense of identity independent of others' approval. These children often had parents who, paradoxically, either modeled extreme authenticity themselves or created such pressure for conformity that the child's psychological survival required resistance. Either way, the child learned early, I can survive without their approval. I cannot survive without my own integrity. These patterns create adults who are comfortable being the only person in the room with a particular perspective. They don't need consensus to feel confident in their position. They're often the ones who say, I think we're making a mistake when everyone else is celebrating. They're the friend who tells you the truth about your relationship when everyone else is being supportive. And they've lost relationships over it. Family members who prefer comfort to honesty. Friends who wanted cheerleading instead of reality. But they've kept themselves. And for them, that math works. Consider what happened when that family dynamic followed you to school, where the social stakes got exponentially higher. Because if you can't perform likability at home, you're definitely not going to start performing it when your entire social standing depends on it. You're in 8th grade. There's a social hierarchy everyone's aware of and carefully navigating. You've been watching people adjust their personalities like dimmer switches, turning up certain traits, dimming others, all to maintain their position in the pecking order. And you realize you're exhausted just watching them. Picture middle school. You see it everywhere. Jenny laughs differently around popular kids than she does around you. Mark pretends not to like things he actually loves because they're not cool. Sarah's entire personality shifts depending on which group she's sitting with at lunch. Everyone's code switching, not just with language, but with their entire being. You try it too for a while. You monitor your laugh, edit your opinions, hide your interests. You learn which topics make you interesting and which make you weird. You're performing an acceptable version of yourself, and you're good enough at it that it almost works. But something breaks. Maybe it's the day you catch yourself lying about liking a band you've never listened to. Maybe it's when you realize you can't remember what you actually think about anything anymore. Or maybe you just get tired. Bone tired of the constant translation between who you are and who you're pretending to be. So you stop. Not dramatically, you don't announce it. You just start being yourself. You admit you don't like that band. You share your actual interests. You stop laughing at things that aren't funny. And predictably, inevitably, your social status drops. Adolescence is typically when impression management, the social psychology term for controlling how others perceive you, reaches peak intensity. Stanford psychologist William Damon found that most people maintain high levels of impression management throughout life. But a subset of individuals experience what researchers call authenticity exhaustion. The cognitive load of continuous self-monitoring becomes unbearable. They make a cost-benefit calculation and determine that social acceptance isn't worth the energy expenditure. Neurologically, they're shifting resources from social monitoring to other cognitive tasks. They've essentially decided to spend their mental energy elsewhere. This creates adults with unusual social freedom. They don't have a work self and a real self. They don't adjust their personality for different audiences. What you see is what you get. And while that means some people don't like them, it also means the people who do like them are liking something real. They're not haunted by imposter syndrome because they're not imposters. They don't fear being found out because they've never hidden. They've traded breadth of social acceptance for depth of authentic connection, and they don't experience this as loss. This pattern doesn't just affect their social life, it shapes their entire professional trajectory. Because when you're willing to be disliked, you make very different career choices than people who need approval to feel safe. You're offered a promotion. It comes with a significant raise, a better title, more influence. There's just one catch. The role requires you to implement policies you fundamentally disagree with. To become, essentially, the enforcer of decisions you think are wrong. Everyone else would take it without hesitation. Picture yourself sitting across from your boss. The offer is on the table. This is the career advancement you've been working toward. Your colleagues would kill for this opportunity. It's the obvious yes, the smart move, the thing you're supposed to want. But you're running different calculations. You're imagining yourself 6 months in, explaining policies you don't believe in, defending decisions you think are mistakes, telling your team to do things you wouldn't do if you had actual choice. You're seeing yourself becoming the kind of person you wouldn't respect. And you feel it clearly. You'd rather have less money and more integrity. You'd rather be passed over than promoted into a role that requires you to become someone you're not. So you say something that stuns your boss. I appreciate the offer, but I don't think I'm the right fit for what this role needs. Your boss looks confused. Your colleagues think you're insane. Do you understand what you're turning down? They ask. You do. You're turning down a version of success that requires betraying what you believe, and you're completely at peace with that choice. Organizational psychologists identify 2 career orientation types. Extrinsic, driven by external markers like status, salary, titles, and intrinsic, driven by internal values like meaning, autonomy, alignment. People comfortable with being disliked demonstrate what researcher Amy Rozesniewski calls calling orientation. They view work through the lens of personal values rather than external rewards. They'll sacrifice advancement for alignment. Studies show they report higher job satisfaction despite lower objective career success. They've essentially opted out of the status competition because their definition of success is internal rather than comparative. These are the people who quit high-paying jobs on principle, who turn down promotions that would require ethical compromise, who speak up in meetings when everyone else is staying silent. They're often respected but not rewarded, valued but not promoted. They cap their own earning potential in exchange for being able to look at themselves in the mirror. And they don't experience this as sacrifice. They experience relief at not having to pretend. While others are climbing ladders that lean against walls they don't actually want to reach, these people are building completely different structures. But let's be honest about what this psychology does to your intimate relationships. Because the same principles that shape your career shape who you let close to you. And that filtering system is uncompromising in ways that can look cold to people who don't understand what's actually happening. You're on a 3rd date. It's going well. There's chemistry, compatibility, shared interests. Then they say something that reveals a fundamental value difference. Not huge, not a deal breaker for most people, but you feel it immediately. This won't work long term. You have a choice to make. Picture this moment. You're at dinner. You like this person. They're attractive, successful, kind. Your friends would approve. Your family would be relieved you're finally dating someone appropriate. It would be so easy to just keep going, to see where it leads, to focus on the good stuff and ignore the value misalignment. But you can't. Because you're already seeing the future conversations where you bite your tongue. The future disagreements where you pretend to agree. The future compromises where you give up pieces of yourself to keep the peace. You're seeing yourself years from now being loved for a version of yourself you had to create for their comfort. So you're honest. Maybe you say, I don't think we're aligned on something that matters to me. Maybe you're more direct. Either way, you end something that could have worked if you were willing to perform compatibility. But you're not. You'd rather be alone and authentic than partnered and performing. The date ends. They're confused. You drive home feeling not sad, but strangely relieved. Attachment theory researchers have identified what psychologist Diana Kirshner calls authentic attachment, the ability to bond based on genuine self-presentation rather than idealized personas. People comfortable with being disliked demonstrate unusually high standards for relationship authenticity. They'd rather be accurately disliked than inaccurately loved. This isn't fear of intimacy. Studies show they form deep attachments when they find compatible partners. But their filtering system is uncompromising. They eliminate prospects not for superficial reasons, but for fundamental incompatibility others would overlook. They're essentially refusing to audition for relationships they'd eventually have to quit. This creates smaller but more authentic relationship circles. They might have 3 close friends instead of 30 casual ones. Their romantic relationships take longer to form, but tend to be more stable because they're built on accurate mutual knowledge. They're the friend who doesn't tell you what you want to hear. They tell you what you need to hear. And yes, this means they're often alone. They experience more solitude than most people. But they're rarely lonely, because loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about being unknown. And they're always known, at least by themselves. Which brings us to what's happening inside their heads when they're being disliked. Because the external appearance of indifference hides something more complex than most people realize about what it actually feels like to live this way. You just spoke your mind in a meeting. You can feel the temperature in the room drop. You see the subtle eye rolls, the shifted postures. You know you just made yourself unpopular. And here's what most people get wrong, you notice. You feel it. It's not that you don't care. Picture the aftermath. You're back at your desk. You replay the moment, your comment, their reactions, the silence that followed. You're aware, acutely aware, of how you're now perceived. The difficult one, the contrarian, the person who doesn't play well with others. You're not oblivious to social dynamics. You read them perfectly. You saw exactly when the mood shifted. You know precisely what you cost yourself socially. But here's the difference. While most people would be spiraling, should I have stayed quiet? Do they hate me now? How do I fix this? You're asking different questions. Was I right? Did I contribute value? Did I stay aligned with my principles? And when the answers are yes, the social cost feels acceptable, not painless, but worth it. This is crucial to understand. You're not numb to disapproval. You're just more uncomfortable with self-betrayal than you are with being disliked. The discomfort of being unpopular is real. The relief of being authentic is stronger. You've essentially trained yourself to prefer one type of discomfort over another. Neuroscience research using functional magnetic resonance imaging shows that social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. People comfortable with being disliked aren't neurologically immune to this. They experience the same neural activation. But what psychologist Kristen Neff calls self-compassion acts as a buffer. They're simultaneously experiencing social pain and offering themselves internal validation. Where most people need external approval to feel okay, they've developed robust internal validation systems. It's not that the disapproval doesn't hurt, it's that their own approval matters more. They've essentially become their own primary source of validation, which makes external validation optional rather than necessary. This creates remarkable psychological stability. They don't have good days and bad days based on whether people like them. Their mood doesn't swing with social approval because their self-worth isn't sourced from it. They're devastated when they violate their own principles, but surprisingly resilient when others disapprove of them living by those principles. They're not performing confidence. They're genuinely indifferent to being misunderstood. And that indifference isn't born from arrogance. It's born from having something more important than popularity, a stable relationship with themselves. This all adds up to something profound when you look at it across a lifetime. You're 45 years old. You look around at your peers and notice something. They're exhausted in a way you're not. They're still trying to manage how they're perceived, still adjusting their behavior for different audiences, still seeking approval from people they don't even respect. And you're just free. Picture this realization. You're at some social gathering, reunion, wedding, professional conference. You watch people your age still playing the game you quit decades ago. They're name-dropping, humble-bragging, performing success. They're monitoring reactions, adjusting their stories mid-telling based on audience response. They're still running that exhausting background program. How am I being perceived? And you feel it clearly. You don't live there anymore. You're saying what you think. You're being who you are. When someone disagrees with you, you're curious about their perspective instead of defensive about your position. When someone doesn't like you, you're genuinely unbothered because their approval was never part of your psychological infrastructure. You've watched people sacrifice their principles for popularity and end up with neither. You've seen people twist themselves into shapes designed for other people's comfort and wonder why they feel empty. You chose differently. And while you have fewer friends, less conventional success, and less social ease, you have something they're all seeking but can't find: peace with yourself. Longitudinal studies on authenticity and well-being show a counterintuitive finding. People who prioritize authentic self-expression over social approval report higher life satisfaction in middle and late adulthood, despite experiencing more social friction in early adulthood. What psychologist Carl Rogers called congruence, alignment between internal experience and external expression, predicts long-term psychological health better than social integration does. These individuals essentially front-load their psychological development. They do the difficult identity work in their 20s and 30s that most people avoid, and they reap the benefits of that work for the rest of their lives. These are the people who age with unusual grace because they never built their identity on things that fade. They're not having midlife crises, trying to figure out who they are. They've always known. They're not haunted by regrets about roads not taken because they took the roads aligned with their values, regardless of where they led. They're not wondering, what if? They know exactly why they made every choice. And while they've paid social costs along the way, they've been accumulating something more valuable than popularity: integrity. They've become, fully and without apology, themselves. Let's be honest, this isn't a superior way to be. It comes with real costs: loneliness, missed opportunities, relationships that could have been if you'd been willing to bend, career advancements you sacrificed on principle. There's legitimate pain in being misunderstood, undervalued, or dismissed by people who matter to you. This isn't about being better than people who care about being liked. It's about being different, and that difference cuts both ways. But here's what makes these people worth understanding. In a world where everyone's performing themselves into exhaustion, they stopped performing entirely. They discovered that the cost of universal approval is too high. It requires continuous self-betrayal. And they made a calculated decision that being accurately disliked is infinitely more sustainable than being inaccurately loved. In an age of curated online personas and epidemic loneliness, despite constant connection, they stand as evidence of another possibility: that you can build a life where you're known rather than liked, where your relationships are real rather than numerous, where your success is defined by internal alignment rather than external validation. They're living proof that social disapproval isn't fatal, that you can be unpopular and psychologically healthy, that the opinion of the crowd matters less than the opinion you have of yourself. That integrity isn't a luxury. It's the foundation of a life that doesn't collapse under its own weight. That's the psychology of people who prefer being disliked. And whether you're one of them or someone who values harmony and approval, there's something to learn here. Not everyone needs to be this way, but everyone could benefit from asking, how much of myself am I willing to trade for being liked? And at what point does that trade stop being worth it? Some people answered those questions early. The rest of us are still figuring it out.